before we get started and I hand this over to Prerna, I wanted to say thank you to DigitalOcean. Thank you to Samantha, where is she, who helped us set this up. Let's all give Samantha a round of applause. DigitalOcean, wonderful space, the beverages, and of course, our wonderful videographer, Edu, who will be filming the event tonight. All right, super excited to introduce to you guys our speaker, Prerna Singh. She is the director of product at Quartz Creative. Previously, she was at Mashable and IBM. She is, in her spare time, my goodness, also runs a non-for-profit, the Pledging Tree Foundation, as well as being the co-lead for the New York City chapter of Women in Product. So does a lot of stuff. I'm sure I forgot a couple of other things, but very excited to have her tonight. So let's welcome Prerna. She'll be talking about data.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that warm welcome, Andrea, and to you and the rest of the Products That Count team for having me tonight. And thank you to DigitalOcean for continuing to support this awesome event series. And thank you to all of you that are joining us tonight, especially in light of the sort of scheduling changes as I battled quite possibly the worst flu of my entire life last week. So I appreciate you all coming out tonight. Before we sort of deep dive into the kind of the heart of tonight's conversation, I kind of wanted to take a pulse on the group. So with the show of hands, how many of you consider yourselves data-driven individuals? All right, raise them high. All right, sounds good. All right, so my follow-up to that is, how many of you consider your organizations or your companies data-driven? Okay. All right, so I'm glad we're having this conversation tonight because it looks like, I think about half of you said that you consider yourselves data-driven, but largely speaking, your organizations are not. So tonight's presentation is going to be kind of a reflection on my own experiences trying to build a data culture within an organization. And I think it's really kind of an interesting time because we're becoming increasingly data-driven, and we talk about sort of being data-driven in this individual capacity. But what I think was really kind of a missing portion of the conversation, which is what I want to touch on tonight, is what does it look like to be talking about data literacy in an organizational capacity? And I think that it's especially true as product builders because we don't build products in a vacuum, right? And now a lot of our product and the success of our product relies on partnerships and alignment across lots of different teams within our organization, alignment with leadership. And so you want to really ensure that you have a culture that really embodies and allows for that alignment to take place. And I think having this particular conversation is really important. So I think context is really important, and I wanted to talk a little bit about why and how I got excited about this particular space. And in order to do that, I thought I would touch a little bit about my background, though Andrea did kind of give a lot of that away. So I really started my love for technology and the role that technology plays in our lives. That really started as I studied human-computer interaction at Carnegie Mellon University. And I kind of took that love for technology and built upon it as I started doing these like large-scale technology transformation projects while I was a change management consultant at IBM. And there it kind of was really interesting to see the role that change plays when you are implementing these large projects, large technology projects within an organization. And kind of reinforced that as I became a UX researcher at places like Google, where we looked at what the new sort of learning and development model might look like for a company like Google. And when I moved over to doing product management at Mashable, this was kind of an opportunity to really lean into that experience of what does it look like to build or implement technology solutions to actually building technology solutions for internal teams. And when I got asked to lead data products and data science at Mashable, it was kind of a culmination of all of these various experiences and realizing that it's not so much just about building, this data product or this, our first internal data reporting tool that Mashable had ever seen, but it was really how do we expand that scope to also think about the culture, because I realized that it wasn't the success of this product relied as much on the product itself as well as like the culture that was sort of surrounding it. So that's kind of where a lot of the conversation that I hope to have tonight is based on that experience. Today I'm a director of product at Quartz Creative, where we are enabling brands to tell better stories that's supported by data. So across all these different experiences, being sort of in change management and doing user research and building products internally, I think the thing that ties all of that together is people. And it's not just people, but it's people in organizations and helping them and enabling them to become more successful. And I think data is that thing, that tool or that mechanism that really allows for that to enable sort of that organizational success. And I think it's such an awesome opportunity for transformation. And we're living in this sort of day and age of transformation as data is kind of this like very sort of thing that is pervasive across the board. So this is why I'm particularly excited about establishing data literacy at this organizational level. So as advertised, I wanted to talk a lot about how we approach this particular problem at Mashable. And wanted to provide kind of a framework for how we thought about this. Now, I'm going to caveat this by saying that this was a huge experiment at Mashable. Like, I don't think we really knew what we were doing. So tonight's conversation is a reflection on the things that we had done and the actions that I think really helped us kind of move the needle a little bit further. But it's also a lot of lessons learned along the way that I hope that as you all are thinking about establishing a data culture within your organizations, you can hopefully kind of take a little bit away from tonight and not make some of the mistakes that we made along the way. So without further ado, as I said, we're going to talk about sort of the ABCs of building data culture. So I will give you this framework in this ABC format. So the A, I'm calling assess and audit. And so this was really interesting because when I got asked to lead data products at Mashable, again, I didn't have the foggiest clue on where to even start. And it's actually rather really intimidating. But I'm a big advocate for leaning into your strengths. And the one thing that I did know how to do was do user research. So I said, okay, why don't we go out and try to actually figure out what the needs are of the users that we're trying to serve? What is the situation today? And I think in hindsight, we think about you're wanting to build a culture and you're trying to build a roadmap. You need to know where you are in order to figure out where you want to go. And so this was a really important and critical step in trying to be able to assess that. So leaned into the sort of user research methodologies that I'm most familiar with and started off with a survey of the newsroom. And this survey was really meant to kind of understand, across the newsroom, across editorial, the video team, the audience development team, what are like in broad strokes, what are the tools that people are using? And second, and more importantly, how are they using it? And being able to offer this sort of like broad categorization allowed us to build kind of a better picture of that landscape to begin with. Because we, again, didn't really have a good idea of where this was going. And then followed that up with some contextual interviews. So followed the editorial team around, did a lot of sort of careful observations, and found some areas where we started to dig in a little bit deeper. And the one thing I think beyond just establishing these attitudes and behaviors, the thing that kind of unveiled itself as we did the surveys and the sort of contextual interviews was sort of like the profound kind of the sentiments that are associated with data. And what I mean by that is that we like kind of unearthed this rather pervasive attitude across the newsroom that was again, something that we didn't really realize was even an issue, which is there was this like kind of attitude of, you know, you're telling us how to do our jobs in this like very creative space. And so this was something that, you know, again, I think from a product data engineering sense, you don't always think about, you know, you're like, we're helping you do your job. This is not an attack by any means. Yet this was something that kind of came out through the kinds of conversations that we were having through this user research. So I think it's really important, you know, sometimes we have blinders on when we're product builders to think, oh, well, we're helping everyone, right? This is meant to be a product to help, but that's not always how that comes across. And so being able to do this kind of user research not only opened my own eyes, but I think opened the rest of the team's eyes to, you know, being able to, you know, be a lot more thoughtful on how we approach this. So we took all of that information, and I was able to, you know, bring in members of our data science team, the data analysts that were across the company, and kind of pull them together to start building kind of a better understanding of this landscape. And we built an assessment criteria that not only looked at sort of these attitudes and these behaviors, but really started to take an understanding of what was the data that was being used and how was it being used, and mapping it to, you know, like what we thought the data quality looked like, and what the data, was there even data available? And most importantly, I think it helped us kind of even start to build a picture of like, is there even strategic alignment, right? Are people even looking at the right things? And I think in a lot of cases, what we ended up finding was that it was like years old heuristics that were just kind of being passed on from like one manager to their team to like, you know, the person that would sort of take over their team and be like, use this number to decide if we're going to post this on social. And it was, you know, in some ways mildly horrifying to go through that process, but I think uncovered a lot of really just a lot of things that we realized that we could attack, and that there was definitely an opportunity to make some much needed changes. So after we kind of did this big assess and audit, the next step was to try to figure out where to even start. And I think upon reflection, I think I personally didn't spend enough time doing this, and there was so much opportunity that I was like, we have to do it all. And that's basically what that turned into. I'm pretty sure this is a live action view of like my first 6 months trying to take this on, which was, oh, like we'll just like, you know, help this team and we'll help that team. Yeah, don't be this cat and don't bite off more than you can chew. That is my, like, if you take nothing away from this presentation, take this away, because it's a pretty, it's a lesson that you learn of the very, very hard way. So this is kind of the sort of phase of what I'm calling this data culture roadmap, where you really start to like kind of look inwards. And you want to make sure that you're not neglecting the data and understanding. Like, you need to have the basic building blocks of your, you know, of your data and your back end in order to actually support pushing along a data culture. Because if that's not figured out, then there's really not much impact that you can make. So like any good product, figure out how to actually like sort of prioritize what you want to work on. For us, self-admittedly, we had a lot of teams that wanted and needed our help, and so we tackled on tacked on a number of teams, but one of the areas that we did find really needed our help was video. Video is a significant portion of our strategy, of our investment, and just simply kind of a black box. And so like leadership didn't know what was going on. People that were building video, like we didn't even know how many videos we were producing in a day, let alone how they were doing. So that was obviously a clear area for us to kind of start attacking. So choose like one or two areas where you feel like there is, based on the need and based on kind of where the company is going, to really focus on, and don't try to like, do it all like that cat. And then the other sort of learning in this phase, which I think we could have definitely spent more time on the first go around, was having conversations with your data engineer or your data architect. I think that this was one of those things where, we kind of got something together. It was really scrappy, and in terms of a proof of concept, it allowed us to, put together a dashboard really, really quickly. But then what ended up happening was that we wanted to add more features, we wanted to add more richness, and as conversations started to evolve and people had more questions about this particular video data, we ended up realizing probably 6 months after spinning our wheels that the entire framework that we had been operating within was completely wrong and just couldn't support the kind of like real-time reporting that we wanted to do. So this is one of those things where, it's hard to anticipate what you're going to need, but I think having those conversations and documenting really early on is going to help at least pave the path and make sure that your data engineer or your data architect is kind of in for the ride along with you, and that you're all learning together, because I think the last thing you want is for it to be kind of this Mayday situation where you have no idea what's going on and you have to catch someone up to speed. So have those conversations with engineering often and early is my recommendation. So we started building with video in mind. That was kind of one of the early teams that we chose to partner with. And so I was really excited because I had been working on the CMS. And the CMS was, I kind of architected it in a way where we could easily collect this video data to answer a very simple question of how many dang videos are we actually making every single day. So super excited, and we kind of put this dashboard together and like was sort of ready for release, and ended up realizing that it was completely wrong. And it was wrong because what ended up happening was that we realized that people's workflows were completely different. And so the way that I thought we were uploading videos in the CMS ended up being completely different. And so then the data was reflective of that. And that kind of leads me to this lesson that your data is only as good as the process, especially as you're doing internal reporting. You want to ensure that what you're actually reporting on, the process itself, is squared away. And for that, context is super important. So the only reason I realized that this video dashboard was completely wrong was because I was working with a video analyst who sat on that team, on the video team. And when I kind of handed that over to him, I mean, it was immediate. He was like, that number doesn't look right. Like, I know, like, there's something funky going on there. And so having him kind of be the partner in this entire process really allowed for us to kind of work together and be able to troubleshoot. So I think this is one of those things where, you can probably figure out the process and spend a lot of time with it, but that effort does not scale. So you really want to be able to find partnerships and collaborate across the company. And then that's the sort of major lesson of this particular phase, is to identify partners in the business that are going to, continue to sort of champion the data cause, if you will. I think specifically for trying to find the right partner, you want to find someone who's well-respected, well-liked, has a really sort of strong voice in meetings, so when you're not there, they can sort of continue to champion the cause, and build that sort of data champion network. This is a principle from change management that I learned while I was kind of working, implementing some of these technology solutions, and it's actually a rather effective one, which is to say that you want to sort of find these people people across the company who, are really close with their peers and their leadership, and they know their space really well. And it becomes a really, you're sort of building the kind of conduit necessary in order to sort of push this message across. So in this particular phase, one of the actually a really awesome kind of outcome of this was that, especially when we were doing a lot of the data validation work, it made it so much easier to have partners that knew the data well enough where I could kind of pass that data validation work off to them while I kind of worked on, being able to manage with a lot of other teams. So even from just that perspective, from a data validation perspective, it's really, really helpful when you have partners in the business that can help you. So we got this video dashboard together, and then it came time to actually roll it out to the company and to sort of the various stakeholders that wanted knowledge of how many videos we were producing in a day. And after a lot of back and forth on the validation, we were finally ready. And I think this is, again, one of those phases where I kind of took for granted, because after doing a lot of internal product development, it was pretty, it was one of those things that we had kind of already set. We knew how to message it. We had internal tools where it allowed us to actually communicate with people. But I think that, in hindsight, this is such an important step, because it allows for you to actually build sort of this two-way communication with your users. And it's important as far as a relationship building aspect goes. I think with typical products, you're always there and you want to collect feedback. But in terms of building culture, this is an opportunity where someone who understands the context, you want to invite those kinds of conversations so that you can better prioritize your own backlog based on the feedback that's coming. So it's important to, I think, spend some time thinking about some of these questions. So how do you plan on training and educating people? What does that sort of mechanism look like? I think one of the hard parts was that it was I had, execs that needed training, and then I needed to train large groups of analysts, and then people who didn't know about data. So you want to kind of build a program that sort of supports all of that. How do you plan on handling communication? I think this was a really big thing, because in the first, 6 months before we got all of our data ducks in a row, things were breaking all the time. And it was rather really difficult to manage that communication of, hey, this dashboard's down, or hey, this data stream's down. And the other hard lesson I think I learned was that in data world, things move really slow, really, really slow. So a bug fix isn't quite something that you can file a ticket for, and then the next day it might be done, or in the next week. It takes a really long time. So you want to be able to manage those kinds of expectations. And then as I had mentioned, how do you plan on collecting feedback? So one of the things that after dealing with random Slack messages all day long, ended up setting up a Slack channel for each team that we were working with. And so in the interest of transparency, I was able to actually manage a lot of those sort of incoming requests and handle the communication, the downtimes, anything that was sort of coming up was sort of funneled through kind of a much more sort of centralized system. So I think just give some thought, and obviously whatever works for your organization, it might be a little bit different, but having sort of just even the time and space to think about something like this was really critical to our overall success. And then lastly, we finally get to sort of the last phase, which I'm calling is you want to evangelize data, this data culture. And I think this goes back to what I was talking about earlier with collaboration and ensuring that you're building this network. You want to ensure that that data has a voice in the room. And that's not possible right now for you to obviously be in every single meeting. So you have to rely on the sort of the power of the network. Realize if you can get into not only make inroads with the analysts, but make inroads with the execs. So we ended up, I built a partnership with someone who is a leader in the editorial newsroom, and she ended up becoming the biggest champion for data. So didn't know, like it's hard because I don't think she always knew like the right words to say, but was always sort of that presence in the room to say, hey, what does this data say about it? And I think just her sort of speaking up kind of had this ripple effect across at least the newsroom to convince some of the naysayers that didn't always think that was, that we could just, move forward with our gut and our instinct and kind of let that take a back seat to actually presenting things with sort of more well-reasoned and well-thought-out arguments with data instead. So this is a real opportunity to, again, realize that you're making inroads and recognizing that it really takes a whole community to make this kind of change happen. And so that's kind of the 5 kind of big phases, I think, of data culture. And I realize I presented this in somewhat of actually a linear fashion, but it's actually not. It is very much a cyclic process, and you kind of have to do this over and over and over again, and you're going to learn a lot of lessons along the way, some of which I shared with you as we kind of went through this process. So that's kind of when you have kind of done it with one team, you do it again with another team, and you kind of slowly build out that momentum across the company. And I will say, once you kind of get going, the influx of requests that come your way and the questions that come your way, it really is truly kind of speaking to the fact that you're making these big sort of mindset changes. And the last thing I kind of want to leave everyone with is that learning to use data is like learning a new language. So I don't know if you remember when you guys were in middle school or in high school. I remember I took years and years of French before I finally felt like I was confident enough to converse in it fluently. And I think that's the same way about learning to use data. It takes a lot of time, and it isn't something that's done overnight, and it takes a lot of patience. So don't be frustrated if this isn't happening overnight, or that in the day-to-day you feel like there aren't changes that are being made, because it very much is something that happens over the course of a lot of time. So that's it for the presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions. Yes?
So I feel like when building a new data infrastructure, it's a lot like, building a plane as you fly it. You have no idea how long it's going to take, what it's even going to look like, what the technical requirements are going to be, especially if you're not the engineer. How do you suggest building a timeline that everyone can sort of be accountable for when you don't really know what that looks like going in?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think that one of the things that the guidance that I think I had gotten early on was to not be so beholden to the way that we think about like regular product management. I think being upfront with like all your various stakeholders that this is very much sort of like a proof of concept and that we're working through it, and it is a sort of a joint learning process really helps sort of caveat it, because I think you're right. Like, I mean, I think for the first like couple of times that we did like the first dashboard we took, it was so hard to even figure out like how long it might take, and we uncovered so many more problems along the way. I think that it takes a couple cycles for you to kind of start to understand the nature of the data and the nature of the way that you've architected it. So I think I hope that I can answer your question, but at least for the first sort of initial kind of few months or how the first few initiatives, I think it's just about sort of managing those expectations. Yes.
What are some of the decisions? Thank you. What are some of the decisions that you've made differently as a company as a result of having better data?
Yeah, great question. So I had mentioned that there were some heuristics that I think the team was using, or that various teams across the company were using that were kind of just like inherited, right? So when you kind of, especially in the sort of assess and audit phase, when, I'd go up and say, well, how do you know that that's the right thing? Like what kind of validation work? Like it was like deer in like the headlights type of thing. So one of the things that kind of comes to mind is one of these heuristics was we were looking at, our audience, like our social team was looking at, they were using a metric on how many clicks a news story was getting once it was posted to our Twitter account to determine if it should go on Facebook. And that was one thing that we were like, wait, what does that correlation even look like? And so that was kind of what was really nice about that. It was scoped out to be a very, like we knew what the decision was, right? Because the backstory is we wanted to be able to post things on Facebook in a much more, the slots on Facebook were a lot more premium, let's just put it that way. So you couldn't put everything on Facebook. So it was a nice, like one of those operational problems, capacity constraint problems, if you will. So we ended up sort of changing the way that people decided on how things went to Facebook, as opposed to relying on this sort of old heuristic of using Twitter instead. And so it was kind of in that nature of problems where these decisions were happening in a really sort of quick turnaround, where we didn't have always like sort of the capacity to build out like a full analysis, but really being able to tackle some of these individual decisions that were happening and provide some insights there. Yes.
I'm curious about collecting feedback on Slack and pros and cons of that. Would you do that again? Would you do anything differently?
Yeah. I think one of the nice things about collecting feedback on Slack is that, obviously it's transparent, so anyone can see. The downside is it's transparent, so anyone can see. And I think that, it was definitely a really good sort of like one-way communication when something was down. It was really awesome to be able to have access to groups of people instead of chasing people down, or people coming to me, right, and being like, this is down. I'm like, I know, we're trying to figure it out. So I think that it was kind of like trying to find the right balance. If there were times where something was really, truly urgent, I would just sort of send an email out instead and allow for that communication to be a little bit more private than being sort of openly broadcasted. So it really depended on the nature. I think the construction of the Slack group is also really important. So like who you choose to include. So there's a lot of sort of thought that needs to be given, because it's like once you start including like leadership, then things are a little bit more shaky. So I kind of had a separate channel for all leadership, so that there were specific things that they were always like kind of looking at. So I could kind of communicate with them and help them understand a little bit more about the timelines and whatnot, and why this was such a big challenge for us, as opposed to to like a level of like analysts where I'm like, it's just broken. We'll tell you. We'll keep you posted when it's back up. So there's just like a sort of different level of communication. So I think just even figuring out how to break up your Slack groups so that it's the right audience is something to keep in mind. Yes.
During the assessment period, you're having these interviews and like collecting all of this feedback and getting an understanding for things, and then you went to prioritizing that feedback. I was wondering if you could talk about how you structured those conversations so that it wasn't just like a huge massive feedback that then like took forever to like actually get meaningful things out of.
Yeah. I think in terms of the data collection, it was really to, again, understand what are the sort of day-to-day decisions that you're making. And understanding what those decision points are is going to help sort of identify like, the impact of that decision, and that's something that you can then do with like your data science team, and having sort of that overview of like what are the strategic objectives of that team or of that company, and kind of assessing like against that, right? Like what is the impact of this decision to the overall objective of the business or the team. And I think to the earlier question, it kind of highlights like where are the areas that need a lot of help. So the conversations were a lot around like walk me through this decision that you have to make around what story you choose to cover or what story do you choose to put to social. And so in that sort of vein, it allowed us to create kind of this framework of, okay, here are the decisions, here's what people are doing, like the heuristic or the metric that they're using, and then you can start to see variances across people's responses. And obviously the more variance there is in that response, the more that kind of highlights why that's such a big deal to fix, because if not everyone is aligned on that same heuristic, then you know that you have kind of a problem on your hands. Yeah. Is that it? All right, one more.
One more.
Okay.
How do you know, at what point to start putting pen to paper and, as you said, like building the wireframe or the structure? Because the minute you do, it just takes on a certain form that's limiting. But you kind of need to funnel all this data you've collected into a product design. Like, how do you stay open-minded while still, putting down a blueprint to move forward?
And when you say like blueprint, what are you envisioning?
Like for example, like the dashboard, like
yes.
your storyboard or whatever for the dashboard. How did you know when it was ready to start, designing?
Yeah, I think so to answer your question, I think one of the things that we ended up doing was working really closely with like sort of that partner, and what I call the collaboration, and that partner really helped kind of bring together what some of the requirements should be, because they again were so intimately aware of like what was going on. And one of the early ways of kind of approaching it was, let's just tackle some of the spreadsheets that people are having to manually gather. And so it was like we kind of used those spreadsheets, the manual like reporting and polls to say, even if we could just automate a little bit of that, it goes such a long way to being able to sort of establish this culture. So we actually used a lot of sort of the spreadsheets to kind of build together at least the basic requirements, and then putting that out there for people to be able to react to. A small group, not like the whole company, but a small group of people that could then kind of respond to it and say, hey, actually this is really good, but I'm often asked to slice the data this way. And I think that it was that very sort of collaborative process up until you can start to build a backlog. I would say like working really closely and tackling those kind of very specific problems allows you to sort of figure out what that framework looks like. Cool.
Awesome.
All right.
All righty. Thanks
Great.
so much, Prerna. Let's give her a round of applause. So awesome. Does everybody still have their blue ticket? I know everybody's like looking at the pizza, but hold on. This is an exciting part of the evening. So I'm going to ask Emily and Terrence, both product managers at One Kings Lane, to help draw. We have 3 giveaways, 2 awesome products that count notebooks, and then a pair of Sammy slippers. So we'll do the first products that count notebook.
379713. No one? 379713.
Come on out. Wow, guys. It's a nice notebook.
Another notebook? 379711.
379718.
All right, you guys, thank you so much. Any shout outs tonight? I know you guys have been here, so maybe a couple of shout outs. Anybody has a gig they want to share? Somebody looking for work, a product they want to share? All right, we're going to skip it. So thank you very much for coming. Before we end for drinks and pizza, a couple of things. One, we are all product people, analytics people, data people. Thank you, Prerna, which means we like feedback. You're going to get an email at the end of the evening. It has a short survey. Please take it because it will let us know how the event was. We always want to get better. So please take it. It helps us quite a bit. 2, next month, our event on May 23rd, we are hosting the head of new products and ventures of the New York Times, Alex McCallum, and she's going to be talking about the transformation that the New York Times went through. It should be very, very fun. So hopefully you guys can join us again. And lastly, we still have some food, just came, hot pizza. Please go have some. We have some refreshments. Prerna will be around here for questions. We have till 9 o'clock. And just make sure that, clean up. DigitalOcean does recycle, so look at the right receptacle bins and put your trash there accordingly. Thanks so much and have a good night.